Imagine you're in 1820. You're standing in a London graveyard at 2 a.m. The air is thick with smell of coal smoke, horse manure, and the faint metallic scent of the Thames River. You aren't here to mourn, you're here to work. You are a resurrectionist, a body snatcher. In your hand is a short, blunt shovel. Beside you is a burlap sack, and under 6 feet of fresh earth is a product that will pay you more than a month's honest wages. But you have to be fast. If the night watchman catches you, you'll be beaten to death by a mob before the police even arrive. If the family of the deceased finds you, they'll do worse. You were living in the golden age of body snatching, a dark 40-year window in history where the human body became the most valuable commodity on the black market. Before we dig into the grisly mechanics of this trade, make sure you've entered the archive by hitting subscribe. Today, we aren't just looking at history, we're looking at the 2026 forensic evidence that shows exactly how these men operated without getting caught. Why was a dead body worth so much? Because in the 1800s, surgery was becoming a superstar profession. Thousands of students flocked to London, Edinburgh, and Philadelphia to learn. But there was a problem. By law, the only bodies surgeons could legally dissect were those of executed murderers. As the law got shorter on executions, the supply dried up. In 1825, there were only about 12 legal bodies available for over 1,000 medical students. The math didn't add up. If a doctor wanted to teach, he had to buy from the shadows. You were the delivery man. But you weren't just a thug with a shovel. You were part of a sophisticated criminal hierarchy. At the top were the extractors, the men who knew the anatomy of a grave better than a surgeon knew the anatomy of a heart. Below them were the lookouts, often women dressed in mourning clothes, who would spend their days scouting fresh burials, marking the spots with subtle cues, a broken twig, a specific stone, or a bit of colored string. You lived in a world of supply and demand, where a winter frost was your worst enemy, making the ground too hard to dig, and a summer heat wave was your second worst, making the product spoil before it reached the dissection table. Every night was a gamble against the clock, the law, and the rot.
Hollywood gets it wrong. They show men digging up the entire 6-foot length of a grave. That is amateur hour. To do that would take 3 hours and leave a mountain of dirt that screamed theft. A professional resurrectionist could have a body out of the ground in 15 minutes. You used a method called the head extraction. First, you'd clear the soil only at the head end of the grave. You'd use a wooden shovel to keep the sound of metal on stone to a minimum. Once you hit the wooden coffin, you didn't unscrew it. You took a crow hook, a massive iron pry bar, and snapped the lid. Because the weight of the earth was still pressing down on the rest of the coffin, the wood would snap cleanly right at the head. The sound was muffled, like a distant gunshot underwater. Then you'd reach into the dark, tie a rope around the corpse's neck or under the arms, and haul it out like a fish on a line. The clothes? This is where the survivalist's logic comes in. You would strip the body completely naked inside the grave. You'd throw the shroud, the suit, or the dress back into the coffin and replace the dirt. Why? Because in the eyes of the 19th century law, stealing a body wasn't a felony, it was a misdemeanor because a corpse had no legal owner. But stealing a shroud or a ring was a capital crime. You could be hanged for stealing a dead man's socks, but only fined for stealing the dead man himself. But the public was fighting back. This was an arms race of the macabre. Families began building Mort-safes, massive iron cages locked over the grave with lead-filled bolts. They hired grave watchers who sat in stone towers with loaded muskets.
Some even used torpedo coffins, rigged with gunpowder to explode if the lid was tampered with. If you were a body snatcher, you had to be a master of reconnaissance. You'd watch the funerals during the day, looking for these traps. You'd look for grave alarms, tiny wires hidden in the grass connected to bells. This wasn't just crime, this was high-stakes survivalism. If you didn't spot the wire, you'd trigger the alarm and find yourself facing a dozen angry men with pitchforks. Your life depended on your ability to see what was hidden in the shadows.
By the late 1820s, the graveyards of Edinburgh had become fortresses. It was becoming too dangerous to dig. The resurrectionist profession was reaching a breaking point, and that's when the trade took its darkest turn. In a dark alleyway in the west port of Edinburgh, two men named William Burke and William Hare realized that the middleman, the grave, was unnecessary. Why wait for someone to die, be buried, and then risk your life digging them up, when you could just create the product yourself? They didn't start as murderers. It began when a lodger in Hare's boarding house died of natural causes, owing £4 in rent. To recoup the money, they sold the body to Dr. Robert Knox, a famous anatomist. Knox didn't ask where the body came from. He just handed over £7, nearly $1,000 today. The easy money changed them. They began luring the vulnerable, the homeless, the lonely, the travelers into their rooms. They would ply them with whiskey until they passed out. Then came the technique that would change forensic history: Burking. One man would sit on the victim's chest to pin the lungs, while the other would put one hand over the nose and the other under the chin to seal the mouth. It was a clean, bloodless death. To a 19th century doctor, it looked like a heart attack or a stroke. No bruises, no struggle, no evidence. They murdered 16 people this way, selling them all to Dr. Knox, who praised the freshness of their specimens. But here is where the 2026 archive comes in. New forensic scans of 19th century teaching skeletons in British museums have revealed a terrifying truth. Using high-resolution bone density mapping, researchers have found microfractures in the hyoid bones and rib cages of specimens that were officially labeled as grave-robbed. These fractures are consistent with Burking, the heavy pressure of a human weight on a chest. This suggests that Burke and Hare weren't one-offs. It suggests that across the Atlantic, in New York and Baltimore, and across the UK, medical murder was a silent epidemic. The doctors were so desperate for knowledge that they effectively funded a serial killer industry. They knew the bodies were too fresh. They knew the snatchers weren't covered in graveyard mud. They simply chose not to look at the blood on the gold they were handing over.
The Resurrection Men era came to a crashing, violent end in 1832. When the crimes of Burke and Hare were discovered, the public went into a frenzy. Burke was hanged, and in a final act of poetic justice, his body was publicly dissected. His skin was even used to bind a pocketbook that still exists today. The government finally realized that the law had to change. They passed the Anatomy Act of 1832, which allowed surgeons to claim the bodies of the unclaimed poor, those who died in workhouses or hospitals without family to pay for a funeral. This effectively ended the black market. If you were a body snatcher, your product was now free for the taking by the state. You were out of a job. But let's look at the survivalists' truth of this era. Every modern surgery you might undergo, whether it's a heart bypass, a knee replacement, or a life-saving transplant, is possible because of the maps drawn by Victorian surgeons. And those maps were drawn using the bodies you dragged through the mud. We live in a world of medical ethics today, but that ethics was bought with the screams of the Burked and the desecration of thousands of graves. The body snatchers were the villains of their time, but they were the silent, filthy partners of modern medicine. They were the ones who provided the fuel for the engine of human longevity. Before the archive closes for tonight, I have a question for you. This is our archive poll. If you lived in 1820 and your children were starving, would you pick up that blunt wooden shovel? Would you risk the gallows and the mob to provide for your family by selling the dead? Or would you protect the sanctity of the grave, even if it meant your own ruin? Drop your choice, A for the shovel, B for the grave, in the comments below. I'll be reading and hearting the most compelling ethical arguments. If you want to see the 2026 evidence of how people survived the horrors of the Black Death, click the video on your screen right now. Every story in the archive is a lesson in what it takes to survive. Stay curious, stay alive. The archive is closed.